Hello and welcome to VHTB, your guide to the talent, culture, and finance side of the space startup ecosystem. My name is Matt Gjertsen from Better Everyday Studios, and today I am joined with Seyka Mejeur from AdAstra Talent Advisors. Seyka, how are you doing today?
Fabulous. Thank you.
Fantastic. And Justus Kilian of Space Capital. How are you doing today,
Hey,
Justus?
great,
Excellent.
great feeling the sprint.
Yeah. There's a lot happening in the space world right now. That is for sure. It is very much a growing industry. Today, I wanted to ask what is seemingly a simple question, but I know it's actually very complicated. And I know it's complicated because every person I have ever worked with in a startup has been confused by it. And that's talking about equity. There's lots of reasons that people join companies. It's to solve big problems. It's to have a lot of ownership, but certainly part of the conversation is always the potential for, outsized rewards over the long term and really being, feeling like you have ownership and a part of something special. But every company that I've been at, it has been very difficult to understand what we are talking about when we're talking about equity. And so, Justus, I wanted to start with you as the finance side of this show. If you could, how should we start thinking about this? Can you give us kind of like a high-level breakdown of what are the different kinds of equity that can get offered to people, to employees in a company?
Yeah, so I love this question. It is inherently opaque, and I think that that's sort of intentional, kind of like lawyers like to speak in
Yes.
legalese. Finance people like to add a lot of structure to things, so only we understand it. So hopefully we could demystify it a little bit. So there are primarily three flavors of stock-based compensation that you see commonly at startups. There's two others, and I'll just briefly touch on those that are like sort of outside of scope, but I'm going to give you the three primary. So, restricted stock is typically what founders get or first employees get. Stock options, these are incentive stock options, ISOs, or non qualified stock options, NSOs, are probably what most people joining a company are going to end up seeing. And then as a company matures, maybe post C going into pre-IPO days, restricted stock units or RSUs become a little bit more common, and there's reasons for that. There's two other flavors that people see, again, depending on the type of company, the way it's incorporated, or whether it's a public company. So the other is stock appreciation rights, or SARs. This can also be called phantom equity. Not very common, but it does happen when companies are incorporated as like an LLC, for example. And then employee stock purchase plans. And these are typically what you get with like publicly traded companies where employees can buy stock at a discount through their payroll deductions. So the first three are really what we're primarily focused on. And
Okay.
the reason, we spend all like those are the primary flavors. Well, the reason doesn't necessarily matter. The thing that people get most hung up on with these different flavors of equity offers is there a cash component required at the point of exercise or at some taxable event? And so understanding that cash component is really important. The tax treatment for the different type
Yeah.
of offering, whether it's going to be taxed as a long-term gain, whether you have to pay it immediately, or whether it's taxed as income, has a direct impact. And then there's
hmm
also impacts at like termination. And so when you leave the company or, depart, that can have an impact that requires you to exercise. And so we could go into all those details, but those are the broad flavors.
Okay, let's start off by because I think I love how you laid out some of those important questions. I want to stick on the definitional piece a little bit. What were the three main ones again? Can you list them out again?
So restricted stock, and this is typically for
Oh,
founders and like the first hires. So it
that's
is actually
that's
stock.
why that's why I was confused. So there's restricted stock and restricted stock units are
Correct.
different things. Okay,
Yep.
gotcha. So restricted stock, that's like very, very few people. Um, what are the differences between restricted stock and ISO or NSO?
So restricted stock is actually stock.
Okay.
Typically, you get this at founding, and then there's
Okay.
some sort of vesting period, which,
Okay.
until you hold it. And so, what's really important about restricted stock is There's typically no cash. The company's worth almost nothing at that
Yeah.
point.
Yeah.
So it's very tax favorable. And so if you get restricted stock, you need to file an 83B election within the first 30 days of receiving it. What that allows you to do is pay taxes on that, grant, this type of compensation immediately when it's worth nothing. And so, basically you have zero cash outlay for buying the shares and zero cash outlay
Got it.
for tax. If you
Okay.
don't, then it's treated as ordinary income as it vests
And
and you'll
that's
have a
probably bad.
tax bill. Yeah, so
Yeah.
important nuance there.
Okay.
83B. Okay.
So and then ISO, NSO, what were I don't think I've ever heard of those before.
Yeah. So ISO is incentive stock option offering. This is only available to employees of a company. And there are, from a regulatory standpoint, limits on how much an individual can be awarded ISO on an annual basis. And so
Mm-hmm.
typically that's up to $100,000 in value.
Mm-hmm.
When the equity compensation goes above that $100,000, that's when you tap into NSO, so
Mm.
non-qualified stock options. And so ISO have a much more favorable tax treatment. They,
It's
typically
all
end up
taxes.
being
Okay.
capital gains. Yep.
Okay.
NSOs are treated as ordinary income,
Got
so
it.
higher tax rate. There's also a little bit more nuance. ISOs typically are required to be exercised 90 days after termination at a company,
Mm-hmm.
um, and that's more of a legal and sort of tax benefit for the company. There's a regulatory requirement around that. NSOs have more flexibility because they could be awarded to advisors, they could be awarded to contractors and also employees. So they're not necessarily like employment based. However, many companies do sort of try to align that like 90-day post termination you need to exercise.
Okay.
And so that's tough because, if the options are valuable at that point or in the money, you have to come up with cash to actually pay for these.
Yeah.
And so, that's really, really tough
I've
for a lot
I've
of
y
people.
yeah, I've heard stories of people that were early at a company that got really successful, and then they were terminated for whatever reason, and all of a sudden had to figure out how to come up with like $500,000 or something because of the tax bill. Okay, so and I'm just trying to break down like why these different things exist really quickly before we get into the other details. And so then the last one was RSUs. It sounds like the vast majority of people, that's what they're going to be dealing with. Does that sound right when they're
So the
joining a
vast
company?
majority of people, if we're thinking about startups, like this would
Yeah.
be seed to probably Series C companies,
Yeah.
are going to get the ISO, NSO stock options.
Oh, okay.
So
Okay.
they are the most complicated. Restricted stock units typically come into effect. So they're non-cash. So
Mm-hmm.
so there's single trigger and double trigger. A single trigger restricted stock unit happens when you have a time-bound commitment. And so
Mm-hmm.
let's just say it's 1 or 2 years. If it's a private company, at the end of that 2-year period, you're actually getting stock. It'll be delivered to you. And so there will be a tax bill associated with the receipt of that. And so if the stock is not liquid, like publicly traded, you will have to come up with the cash to actually be able to pay for it.
Mm-hmm.
So typically it's not used until later when you're anticipating a public offering and then the
Mm,
shares can be sold. And so it's actually very efficient at later stages because the company will just hold back any tax obligations. And so you just get the payout. You don't have to pay any cash. And it's a very clean, nice way to do it.
okay. Okay. Thank you for all that. There's a lot of other details, obviously. Seyka, I want to shift to you because you deal with a lot of offers to folks I'm sure you have to have lots of conversations with people of explaining kind of the intricacies. Justus touched on this a little bit of, there's vesting schedules and when what is due. What are the most common things that you're having to explain to people? What are the most common questions that people have during the offer phase?
Yeah, great question. I love talking about this. Equity comes up so much in offer conversations and in negotiations. And to zoom out a little bit, we'll look at kind of the perspectives that people are often coming from into these
Great. Yes.
conversations, right? So
Great.
there will be often early on in conversations, I like to start to tease apart how are you going to evaluate an offer from a startup? And you can, predict pretty well how people are going to be thinking about equity based on where they've been before. So you see people who
Yes.
are coming from SpaceX or Amazon, where not only has equity been real cash that's liquid that they can access and utilize, but it has been incredibly valuable, right? And they've been able to see that proven out. There are also people who have been at startups. Maybe they were, within the first 20 people, then they go through an acquisition or they go through going public and they go, wow, I really thought that equity was gonna be worth something. And it really was not. It was not meaningful. And, there are people I'm not gonna throw any companies under the bus, even though maybe I should. There are people that have come from well-known space companies that were given a meaningful portion of their compensation in equity that they were just never able to realize. They never really got that assigned to their name, and it ended up being kind of just a complete fabrication of
Yeah.
compensation, right? So we have to
Yeah.
understand the perspective that people are coming into those conversations with. And you'll notice a very strong difference in how they are going to evaluate offers based on that background, right? Makes sense. So, getting clear on where somebody's coming from is really valuable, and helping founders and executive teams that are hiring leaders into their or people into their startups be able to really get down to the bare bones of what these offers really mean and how candidates can conceptualize that information. And now, frankly, Justice, you were just giving a lot of insight that is new to me, right? I didn't know some of those details, and I'm having equity conversations every single day. And I think that points to a really cool point, which is we are often having conversations with executives that have been at startups that have equity to their name and feel like they should probably know all of the information that you just shared, but they don't. And by the time they get into an offer conversation, they maybe feel like it's a dumb question to ask. Shoot, I should know this already. And
Yes.
so it can be really useful to have, I find that I get in and I go, okay, let's tease this apart. Like, do you really understand what this offer is in terms of equity? The answer is often no when we get down to it. And once we can get through, like, these questions aren't dumb. This stuff is complicated. Let's break it
Because
down.
because I feel like so often when you try to ask those questions, and this is why I love the way you're explaining this, because I feel like you get answers at the extremes where you have legal or finance that want to be this is all fake, none of it's real. There is no, like, we might as well not even have it here. I can't promise you anything. Because that's kind of true. But then you have the other side of the equation where whether it's the hiring manager or somebody else is like really trying to sell you on the stuff that's like, this is how you're going to get rich. I got rich off of this from, in my past company, and this is going to be amazing. And it's really important to find that balance.
Exactly. Exactly. And having those conversations early on. For example, I've seen startups, like 5 years ago, right? And from inception, the founder was saying, this is going to be liquid quickly. As soon as I'm able to do a buyback, I want people to have access to, even though we don't have a plan to IPO in the near future, I want people to have access to cash quickly and then delivered on that. And I think that even that question is a useful one to be
Yeah.
asking, right? What is the vision for liquidity? How will
Yes.
I have access to these funds?
Yes. Because isn't that something that happened at Airbnb, I believe? This was a long time ago, but not that happened, but the reverse of that, where the equity had a time limit on when it kind of went away because everybody assumed that the company would go public, but it was so long before they went public that they were running into a limit where all the options were just going to like disappear and nobody was going to exercise anything. Or there was something. This was like 5-6 years ago, and I think they sorted it out. But yeah, there's lots of those little things. I guess kind of on the point that you just mentioned, Justus, do you see any difference kind of on the founder side as well, of like maybe it's like second-time founders or people who have been this before having a better understanding of what equity means and how they want to approach it?
I think the most sophisticated organizations, and I would argue sort of driven by the founders, really try to lean into displaying the value of the equity compensation and almost trying to help you understand their fundraising milestones over time
Mm,
and what that could equate to in terms of valuation if we hit these
yeah.
targets. And so they sort of bring you into the plan of the company and the potential outcomes that could be realized. So you feel a little bit more equipped in terms of the value and the meaning behind these numbers. And so I think that typically is what I see from more sophisticated organization. It doesn't necessarily have to be a serial entrepreneur, but
Sure.
oftentimes that serial founder like has seen their equity go to zero multiple times, and this is the next big one. So they want to help people sort of understand, the downside, the middle road, and the upside.
Yeah, I like that. I like that. Any other, say you mentioned, just understanding people's mindset is really important and make sure they have the right mindset. Any other things that commonly come up?
Yeah, let me outline this a little. So, just to echo the point you were just making, Justice, we see the exact same thing. We say, let's talk about equity with these candidates so that they can really see how valuable this is. And for less sophisticated founders, I'll often hear, we really shouldn't say anything because
Mm,
I'm like, we could just say number of shares. And we go, that's not enticing. We have to help them see the picture. And we're going to put in a lot of qualifiers that none of this is guaranteed. It may go to zero. We have to be very direct and clear about that. And these are big boys and big girls who can take that information and incorporate it so that they can also see what is possible. So let's talk about some of those items, right? If we're talking about, we need to have complete information so we can understand current value. So whether that's valuation and number of shares or number of shares and what percentage that is of the company, understanding the predicted path of dilution and what that is going to mean for the equity in this offer, understanding, again, as I mentioned earlier, the vision for liquidity. Is that something that's on the mind of the leadership team? And what is the path to that? The vision for future valuation. So touching on Justus's last point, what are the technical milestones? What is intended to reach those technical milestones at each raise? And what does that mean? What does that indicate for valuation at that point? And with that information, also taking into account understanding, what the taxes look like, how much money you may have to come out of pocket with in order to exercise the equity. And from all of that information, you can create a relatively simple spreadsheet that looks at, with the equity that I am being offered, if the company goes to zero, I'll have zero. Let's be straight up about that. If the company hits this level of valuation, this is what my equity would look like. And you can make many stops along that point, right? So if we achieve all of our goals, this is a unicorn or a multi-unicorn startup, what could this be? And the different steps along that path, it just gives you clear information. And we're typically talking about people that come from an engineering background and they like information.
yeah.
And so the word that I typically look for in, what Seyka just sort of laid out is an offer to dollar translation, right? And so it's like, here's the package. Help me understand what that looks like over a few scenarios. So that's the word you should anchor to try to help, get, or the phrase you should anchor to help understand that impact.
I like that. Yeah, I think, and I feel like that's where you find that balance, as you were saying, Seika, the qualifiers and I feel like even the candidate probably needs to be careful with how they ask this question so they can get a straight answer. But it's really being clear about, so if this happened, then it could be worth this amount. Like that's ultimately what you're trying to get to. And then the follow-up is like, okay, and then that means what for me in terms of amount I have to pay for taxes or anything like that.
I
Well,
think that there is one other sort of important lens. Did you want to take this in another direction? Because I
no,
have one
please,
other.
please.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, um, I do recommend that every candidate who is receiving equity put on sort of an investor mindset when they're evaluating the role and the total comp. And so I think that this is often helpful in actually making the decision to accept the offer and join the company. And I think there's three ways that you sort of can ask that. It's like, why do I want to join the company? That's the clearest and the easiest one that everybody's asking. Why does this company matter? If it doesn't matter, if it's only sort of marginally valuable, it's not going to be an outlier. And why is this team going to win? Why am I
Mm,
joining and signing up to be a part of this great team? And so answering those three questions can, I think, give you a bet like an investor, a small investor sort of mindset to the value of the equity. The other thing is looking at, options are you're going to spend anywhere from like maybe 2 to 5 years at a company in a startup. And that's pretty long tenure, actually. So you're probably going to be working at maybe 3 to 5 companies over sort of the highest energy, highest sort of earning potential phase of your career. And so what you are doing is essentially building a small portfolio of very
yeah.
concentrated bets on, potentially a retirement outcome for yourself. And so that investor mindset is super critical. Like, why is this, valuable? And the probability that any one of those will succeed is, less than 5%, probably less than 1% of achieving the very large outcomes. So you're only getting, 3, 4, 5 shots on goal. You really have to have a high conviction, high probability that, these are going to actually, return you meaningful outcome. And so you could diversify that across the companies you choose to work with and look at it as a little bit of a portfolio you're building over time.
Yeah. I love that. So I think the final takeaway, though there's plenty of more questions to be asked here, but it kind of comes down to with exactly what you just said of having that investor mindset, using that investor mindset to ask questions and ask follow-up questions and don't just assume you know what's going on, but be really clear about what the potential outcomes are and be really clear about what those outcomes mean for you. I think that's kind of at least a way to get started from the candidate side of things to really when you're evaluating an offer that has equity, where to get started. But there's a lot to it, so I don't know. Maybe we'll come back to this another time because and focus on just one individual piece of it. I definitely learned a lot, so thank you both so much, and I look forward to the next conversation.
Thanks, Matt.